I want you to imagine a scenario that seems just completely impossible. Like, imagine a modern superpower, let's say the United States, being entirely conquered, just totally dismantled by a relatively small, virtually unknown militia. And all of this in the span of just 4 years.
Right, which is just unthinkable.
Exactly. It's unthinkable. It breaks all our basic assumptions about how power works. But now I want you to imagine something even wilder. Instead of that victorious militia erasing the defeated American culture, the militia's leaders move into the White House. They start wearing American suits, speaking English, and, hiring Wall Street bankers to run their new global empire.
Yeah, the vanquished culture essentially swallows the victor's whole.
Yes, and that exact dynamic, that bizarre and fascinating inversion of power, is what happened to one of the mightiest superpowers of the ancient world.
It really fundamentally challenges our basic assumptions about how history works.
Yeah.
We are so conditioned to believe that military victory just equals cultural domination.
Right, like the winner gets to write the history.
Exactly. We think the winner imposes their way of life. But what we are looking at today is a society that was completely decimated by the sword, yet somehow responded by conquering its conquerors. And they did it using the pen, the ledger, the astrolabe, and just the sheer gravity of their intellectual tradition.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Our deep dive today is an extensive, granular look into Chapter 3 of the historical text, Arabs, Islam, and Persians. We're setting out to understand how the massive Sasanian Empire, the Persian behemoth that had dominated the Middle East for centuries, just collapsed almost overnight to the sudden Arab-Islamic conquests.
And we're going to trace the genesis of Islam in the harsh Arabian desert, look at how it reshaped Persian society, and then watch as Persian intellect, philosophy, and administrative genius essentially built the foundation of the Islamic Golden Age.
We're talking about an arc that includes everything from profound theological debates to masked prophets literally launching fake glowing moons into the sky from the bottom of wells. It's wild.
It is. And as we navigate this incredibly dense history, we really have to look past just the dates and the names. The dates are just the scaffolding.
Right.
What we really need to identify are the underlying patterns of human behavior. Why do seemingly invincible states collapse? What is the psychological magnet of a new religious movement?
How do the cultures negotiate and clash?
Exactly. We want to understand the actual mechanisms of these massive societal shifts.
So let's jump right into the collapse itself, because the sheer speed of the Sasanian defeat is just staggering. To give you some context, the Prophet Muhammad passes away in 632 AD, and then just 4 years later, in 636, a relatively small Arab force faces off against the massive, heavily armored Persian army at a place called Qadessia.
Yeah, and the Persian commander-in-chief is killed there.
Right, his army is entirely routed. And a couple of years after that, the imperial capital, Ctesiphon, falls. Then you have another battle at Nahavan, and the Persian army is destroyed again. I mean, in less than a decade, an empire that had stood for hundreds of years it's gone. The maps are wiped clean.
Which is hard to wrap your head around.
It really is. I have to admit, reading this, I'm stuck on the mechanics of it. How does a superpower crumble that fast? It just doesn't make logical sense.
Well, it doesn't make sense if you only measure a state by the size of its military. But our source material offers a synthesis that really forces us to look inward. I mean, the Arab armies were incredibly motivated and they possessed brilliant tactical mobility, but they didn't break the Sasanian Empire.
Wait, they didn't?
No, the Sasanian Empire was already broken. It had suffered from decades of continuous, exhausting, and ultimately pointless wars of attrition with the Byzantine Empire. But the deeper, truly fatal flaw was internal. The state had become profoundly disconnected from and universally despised by its own people.
Let me try to put an analogy to this. It sounds like a modern, too-big-to-fail financial institution right before a market crash.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Yeah, like if you're walking past the headquarters, it looks invincible. Marble columns, thousands of employees, a brand that feels permanent. But inside, the executives have completely hollowed it out. It's surviving entirely on leveraged debt and toxic assets. The Arab army, in this scenario, was just a small but highly disruptive startup that exposed the rot.
The bank was going to collapse the moment a strong wind blew. The Arabs just happened to be the wind.
Wow, yeah.
That captures the structural vulnerability perfectly, and it reveals a vital historical pattern, right? When a state becomes that disconnected, that oppressive, the social fabric dissolves. You have to remember, the Sasanian world was defined by a brutal, rigid caste system.
Right. If your father was a shoemaker, you were a shoemaker.
Exactly. If he was a peasant, you were a peasant. There was zero upward mobility, and it was coupled with just crushing taxation to fund those endless Byzantine wars. So when the Arab armies appeared on the horizon, the Persian populace didn't rally to the defense of the
So
crown.
you just watched it happen.
Pretty much. They largely remained neutral, or in some cases, they actually welcomed the disruption. The text explicitly notes that people across the social spectrum were yearning for a millennium.
A millennium, like a new era.
Yes, a messianic new era of justice to just wash away the old corrupt order. They had completely lost the will to uphold the status quo.
And the ultimate symbol of that pathetic, hollowed-out status quo is the final Sasanian king, Yazgurd III. I mean, you would expect the King of Kings to make a heroic last stand at the gates of his capital, sword in hand.
But he doesn't.
No, he doesn't. He runs. He flees further and further east, hauling whatever royal treasures he can carry, just desperately trying to find a provincial governor who will protect him. He eventually makes it all the way to Marv, in modern-day Turkmenistan. And the romanticized myth is that he was hiding in a mill and a poor miller murdered him just to steal his shiny jewelry.
Yeah, the myth is poetically tragic. But the historical reality, which the source points out is far more likely, is deeply indicative of the systemic rot we are discussing. Yazgurd was almost certainly betrayed and assassinated on the orders of his own governor in Marv, a man named Mahusuri.
Wow, his own governor.
Right. Let's look at the mechanism of that betrayal. When your own appointed officials, the people whose power derives entirely from the crown, decide that murdering you is more politically advantageous than protecting you, the state is already dead. The idea of Sasanian legitimacy had evaporated long before Yazgurd took his last breath.
Okay, so if the old ideology was essentially a dead man walking, we have to ask what the new ideology was bringing to the table. What was this new system that was powerful enough to not only energize these conquerors coming out of the harsh Arabian desert, but eventually rewire the minds of the conquered Persians?
To understand that, we really need to rewind the clock slightly and look at the actual genesis of Islam. We have to trace this back to the socioeconomic reality of Mecca, where the Prophet Muhammad was born around 570 A.D.
Right, into the Hashim clan of the Quraysh tribe.
Exactly. He grows up to be a merchant, he travels the trade routes to Syria and Palestine, and he earns a distinct reputation in his community. He is known as Amin, the trustworthy. He marries Khadija, who is his employer and a very wealthy, independent businesswoman. So for the first 40 years of his life, he is deeply embedded in the normal socioeconomic fabric of this city.
But Mecca wasn't just a normal city, right? I mean, the text makes it clear that it was essentially a massive economic hub built entirely around pagan pilgrimage.
Yes, the Kaaba was filled with idols from all the different tribes across the Arabian Peninsula.
People would travel there, bringing trade, wealth, and establishing a truce during the pilgrimage months. So when Muhammad, at the age of 40, goes into a cave and receives this terrifying, awe-inspiring revelation from the angel Gabriel to read, and comes back down with the message that there is no God but the one God, he isn't just starting a theological book club.
No, he is threatening the entire foundation of their world. This is where we have to look at the why behind the immediate persecution he faced. To the ruling elites of the Quraysh tribe, this strict monotheism was an existential threat.
Because it threatened the money.
Absolutely. Their political power, their wealth, and the peace of the region relied on managing that polytheistic sanctuary. If all the idols are false, the pilgrims stop coming. If the pilgrims stop coming, the economy crashes.
It's like walking into the headquarters of a multi-billion-dollar tobacco company and somehow getting a megaphone to declare to the world that their primary product is poison, and then expecting the executives to just have a polite debate with you.
They aren't going to debate you.
Right? They're going to try to crush you because you are threatening their bottom line and their societal dominance. And that is exactly what happens. The persecution gets so intense that by 622, Muhammad and his early followers, including his cousin Ali and his close companion Abu Bakr, are forced to flee for their lives.
This flight, the Hijra, is a pivotal mechanism in Islamic history. They migrate to the town of Yathrib, which becomes Medina. It is so monumental that it becomes year zero of the Islamic calendar.
Really, that's year zero.
Yes, because in Medina, Muhammad is no longer just a persecuted preacher. He becomes a statesman. He begins to form a cohesive community, the Ummah. From that point on, a state of war exists between Medina and the powerful elites back in Mecca.
And the military timeline here is fascinating because it's not just a string of overwhelming victories. It's a bitter struggle, you know? You have the Battle of Badr in 624, which is this massive underdog victory that gives the Muslims serious momentum. Then you have Uhud the next year, which is a devastating setback, though they survive.
Right.
But the turning point that really catches my eye is the Battle of the Trench in 627. The Meccans march on Medina with an overwhelming force, but the Muslims don't fight a traditional Arabian tribal skirmish. They dig a massive dry moat around the entire city. And the source text points out that this brilliant, totally foreign tactical innovation was suggested by a man named Salman the Persian.
The inclusion of Solomon the Persian at this incredibly early stage is deeply symbolic of the cultural synthesis that is about to explode across the region. I mean, the Arab tribes were accustomed to cavalry charges and open desert skirmishes. A siege moat totally neutralized their primary military advantage.
So the siege just fails.
Exactly. The Meccan siege fails, their coalition fractures, and the balance of power permanently shifts. By 630, Muhammad's movement is so politically and militarily formidable that when he finally marches back to Mecca, the city surrenders without a fight.
Which is amazing.
He grants a general amnesty, which is a brilliant political move to prevent endless blood feuds, but he immediately destroys the idols in the Kappara. In an astonishingly short period before his death in 632, he unifies the fractured, fiercely independent Arabian Peninsula under a single banner.
Intertwined with all this intense political and military maneuvering is profound mystical event that I think is crucial for understanding the spiritual weight of this new religion, the Ascension, or the Mirage. The text details the belief that Muhammad miraculously traveled from Mecca to Jerusalem in a single night and from there ascended through the heavens.
Meeting earlier prophets like Moses and Jesus.
Right, before coming into the presence of God. I love how the Persian poet Sadi described this. He wrote that Muhammad got so incredibly close to the divine that the angel Gabriel actually had to stop and stay behind because it wasn't an angel's place to go that far.
It is arguably one of the most stunning pieces of poetic imagery in the Islamic tradition. Now, we must analyze how this functions historically and theologically. The source notes that there is a spectrum of interpretation here.
Like literal versus metaphorical.
Yes, many believers view this as a literal physical journey through time and space. However, other scholars have historically argued it was a purely visionary spiritual experience. But if we look at the function of the ascension, regardless of the physical mechanics, it serves to legitimize Islam not as an isolated phenomenon in the desert, but as the final crowning chapter of the grand Abrahamic tradition.
Ah, I see.
It links Muhammad directly to the spiritual lineage of the prophets recognized by Jews and Christians.
Right, which bridges us perfectly into the actual day-to-day theology, because if you're a Persian who has just watched your King of Kings get murdered in a windmill and these new conquerors arrive, you aren't immediately going to be swayed just by the story of a night journey. You're going to look at the rules, like what does this religion actually demand?
Exactly.
So let's break down the pillars. The word Islam itself means submission to the will of God. And as we just said, it firmly anchors itself in the Abrahamic world. It views Christ as a massive, revered figure, born of a virgin, a great prophet, but it draws a hard line against his divinity.
That hard line is the absolute uncompromising core of the faith. Strict monotheism. The text outlines the foundational pillars. You have the belief in the one God. You have prophethood, the acceptance that Muhammad is the final messenger. And you have the day of judgment, a profound equalizer where all humans will be held accountable for their actions.
And the Shiite tradition adds to this, right?
It does. It's vital to note here that the Shiite tradition, which will become deeply important to our narrative later, adds two additional pillars, divine justice and the imat, the belief in divinely guided specific leadership. But alongside the theology, Islam introduced an incredibly structured daily framework.
Right, the 5 daily prayers, fasting, almsgiving, the pilgrimage. It forbade alcohol, pork, and incest.
Yeah.
I want to push back on this a little, though, or at least play devil's advocate. If I am a Persian citizen, I already have a very complex religion in Zoroastrianism. I have a structured life. Now, these new rulers arrive with a massive list of new rules. Pray 5 times a day, give away your money, don't drink wine. Why would that appeal to me on the ground? What is the actual psychological hook for an ordinary person living in the 7th century?
The hook is the radical paradigm shift in social value. Think back to our discussion of the Sasanian state. It was a suffocating caste system.
Oh, right, the shoemaker thing.
Exactly. The priest and the nobility owned you. Your bloodline determined your entire existence. Then Islam arrives with a fundamentally egalitarian message. The text highlights a core tenet. Muslims are brethren. The most severe sin is to be unjust to another human being. It emphasized moral obligations to the poor, to orphans, to society at large.
So no untouchable elites.
Right, there was no celibate priesthood hoarding wealth. Your worth in this new system was theoretically based entirely on your piety and your actions, not who your grandfather was.
Yeah.
For a society exhausted by centuries of aristocratic privilege, the idea that a peasant and a prince stand shoulder to shoulder in prayer and will be judged by the exact same metric on the Day of Judgment held immense, revolutionary psychological appeal.
That makes a lot of sense. It's not just a change in gods, it's a change in your own personal value as a human being. And we really need to look at how this affected the status of women because the source provides a very impartial, nuanced comparison. Under the Sasanian Empire, women were legally classified as property. They were literally owned by their fathers or their husbands.
Which is horrifying to modern ears.
Completely. Early Islam, by stark contrast, recognized women as legal entities. They were granted specific rights to inherit property, though the text notes they inherited half the share of a male, and they had certain rights to initiate divorce. The dress code, the hijab, did not initially mandate covering the face and hands.
We have to analyze this very carefully, though, and avoid falling into the trap of viewing 7th century policies through a 21st century lens. Was early Islam egalitarian by modern democratic standards? No. The text points out, men had easier access to divorce and could take up to 4 wives.
Right.
Though the caveat was a strict Quranic demand to treat them all equally, which many scholars argued was a practical impossibility meant to limit the practice.
Yeah.
However, compared to the Sasanian reality where a woman was literal chattel, it was a massive structural elevation.
It's a huge step up.
It is. We see this agency reflected in the history itself. The prominent women of early Islam, Fatima, the Prophet's daughter, Aisha, his widow, Zainab, his granddaughter, these were not passive figures locked in a tower. They were political actors, leading armies, negotiating treaties, and shaping the direction of the faith.
That context is crucial. But this brings us to a massive misconception. If you are listening to this and assuming that because Islam offered these social upgrades, the Persian population immediately threw down their Zoroastrian fires and mass converted the moment the Sasanian king died, you would be completely wrong. It didn't happen overnight.
What's fascinating here is that it didn't happen overnight for a very specific and somewhat surprising administrative reason. The Arab conquerors, in the initial decades, actively discouraged the Persians from converting to Islam.
Wait, hold on. A religiously motivated conquest that actively tells people not to join their religion. That sounds incredibly cynical. It sounds like a protection racket.
It was an economic reality.
Yeah.
Let's look at the mechanism of the early Islamic state's revenue. Non-Muslims living under Islamic rule were considered people of the book and were protected, but they were required to pay a specific poll tax called the jizya.
Ah, the tax.
Yes. This tax was the financial lifeblood of the new empire. If a Persian converted to Islam, they were legally exempt from the jizya. If the entire population of Persia suddenly converted, the Arab state would go bankrupt overnight.
Yeah.
They literally couldn't afford for the Persians to become Muslims.
That is wild. So it was economics over epiphany. When people did start converting, it wasn't necessarily because they had a sudden theological awakening. It was pragmatic. You look at your tax bill, you look at the fact that you can't hold certain high military ranks unless you're a Muslim, and you make a calculated family decision.
Exactly.
It's a slow burn.
Yeah.
The source text says it took roughly 2.5 centuries for the majority of Iran to convert.
Precisely. And this slow burn happened at wildly different speeds depending on the geography. Our source gives a brilliant breakdown. In Fars, the southern province that was the historical heartland of the Sasanian kings and the spiritual epicenter of Zoroastrianism, resistance to conversion was fierce and prolonged. They clung to their ancestral identity.
Makes sense. It was their headquarters.
Right. But if you look at the eastern province of Khorasan, it's a completely different story. The Arabs needed to protect their borders against Central Asian threats, so they established massive military garrisons in Khorasan. The heavy intermingling of Arab soldiers with the local population, the intermarriages, and the integration of locals into the military apparatus acted as a massive catalyst for conversion.
And then you have the geographical anomalies like the Caspian provinces in the north. If you've ever seen pictures of northern Iran, it's separated from the rest of the country by the Alborz Mountains, these massive, jagged, densely forested peaks. The Arab cavalries couldn't penetrate them.
The Sasanian kings could barely control them.
Exactly. So the people in the Caspian region held out the longest, and when they finally did convert, centuries later, They didn't convert to the mainstream Sunni Islam of the caliphs in Baghdad. They were converted by Shiite missionaries, rebels and refugees who had fled into the mountains to escape the state's persecution.
That isolation created a profound sanctuary for dissenting theology, which would become explosive centuries later. But while this slow patchwork conversion is happening, we need to address another historical myth that the text explicitly dismantles: the myth of Iranian silence.
Right.
There is a modern nationalist narrative that claims for the first 200 years after the conquest, the Persians were culturally dormant, just silently brooding under Arab occupation.
The source material basically calls that idea completely absurd. They weren't silent at all. They were the ones keeping the lights on. The Arabs had just conquered one of the most complex, agrarian, heavily administered societies on Earth, but they didn't have the institutional memory to run it.
They had no idea how to manage it.
They didn't know how to assess a complex land tax based on crop yields, or how to maintain centuries-old irrigation networks, or how to run an imperial postal service. So who did they hire? The exact same Persian bureaucrats who had been doing it for the Sasanians. The scribes just switched the language of the ledgers and went back to work.
Exactly. This is the phenomenon of administrative continuity. You can conquer a capital city, but if you cannot run the tax bureaus, your empire will fragment and starve in a decade. The Persians possessed this incredibly dense, generational institutional knowledge. So while they lost their independent political state, they immediately embedded themselves into the very nervous system of the new Arab empire.
They became indispensable.
They did. They learned Arabic, the Arab elite slowly began absorbing Persian cultural norms, and this quiet bureaucratic synthesis laid the foundational groundwork for the massive cultural explosion that would follow.
But while the Persian bureaucrats are quietly running the day-to-day operations of the empire, the Islamic world itself is tearing itself apart at the very top. This brings us to the Great Schism, the tragic, complex, and bloody division between Sunnis and Shias.
Yes.
If you are listening to this, you know this divide still shakes global geopolitics today. And according to the source text, it all traces back to a single explosive question that arose the moment the Prophet Muhammad died in 632. Who is in charge now?
And this is where we must examine the history with strict impartiality. We are looking at the theological and political claims as historical phenomena, without endorsing the divine validity of either narrative. The crisis was immediate because Muhammad died, without leaving a universally recognized, undeniably explicit protocol for succession.
Right, there was no clear will.
Exactly. The nascent community immediately fractured over the mechanism of choosing a leader. One camp, which included many of the early prominent companions from Mecca and Medina, believed the leader, the caliph, should be elected by the consensus of the community's elders, based on the candidate's capability, wisdom, and piety. They held a council and elected Abu Bakr as the first caliph.
But there was a second camp that fundamentally disagreed with the premise of an election. They believed that leadership of the Muslim community was not a political office to be voted on. It was a divine mandate that belonged strictly within the bloodline of the Prophet.
Specifically to Ali.
Right, Ali, who was Muhammad's cousin and also his son-in-law, having married Fatima. This group believed that God had preordained Ali and that Muhammad had actually designated him before dying. This faction became known as the Shia Ali, the partisans of Ali. Because Ali and his close supporters were busy preparing the Prophet's body for burial during the election of Abu Bakr, they felt completely bypassed and politically disenfranchised.
This initial fracture set the stage for decades of brutal instability. The first four caliphs, Abu Bakr, Omar, Osman, and finally Ali, are revered in the Sunni tradition as the Rashidun, the rightly guided. But historically, their reigns were defined by incredible turbulence.
It was incredibly violent.
Yes. Omar, the architect of the Persian conquest, was assassinated by a Persian captive. Osman, whose later rule faced widespread accusations of nepotism and corruption, was besieged in his own home in Medina and hacked to death by rebels. By the time Ali finally assumes the caliphate, he inherits an empire that is actively devouring itself.
Ali's entire 5-year reign is essentially one long, agonizing civil war. He first has to fight a rebellion led by Aisha, the Prophet's widow, at the Battle of the Camel. He survives that, but then he faces an even more massive existential threat from Muawiyah.
The governor of Syria.
Yeah, Muawiyah is this incredibly powerful governor of Syria. He's got a seasoned army, and he is a relative of the murdered Caliph Osman, demanding vengeance. Ali and Muawiyah fight a massive battle that ends in this confusing, controversial arbitration. And that decision to arbitrate causes a radical, puritanical faction of Ali's own army to turn on him. They're called the Kharijites.
Their logic was Terrifyingly simple.
It really was. They believed that by accepting human arbitration, Ali had compromised the absolute law of God. And it is one of these Kharjite radicals who assassinates Ali with a poisoned sword in a mosque in the year 661.
The assassination of Ali is the definitive end of the early, idealized era of the caliphate. Muawiyah leverages his power in Syria to establish the Umayyad dynasty, ruling from Damascus. He turns the caliphate from a religiously guided community into an absolute hereditary monarchy. The followers of Ali, the Shiites, utterly reject this.
They saw them as illegitimate.
Entirely.
Mm.
They view the Umayyads as corrupt, worldly usurpers. And this is where we need to look deeply at the theological architecture the Shiites built in opposition to the state, specifically the 12-verse Shiite tradition. They developed the concept of the imam.
Which is different from just a prayer leader.
Very different. In this context, an imam is not just someone who leads Friday prayers. An imam is the singular, divinely chosen, infallible leader of all humanity, descending directly through the line of Ali and Fatima. They believe the imams possessed esoteric divine knowledge.
And here's where the history completely blows my mind, because the overlap with ancient Persian culture is just too perfect. Before the Islamic conquest, the foundational belief of the Sasanian kings was the concept of the far.
Yes, the divine glory.
The far was this mystical, God-given glory or mandate. If a king possessed the far, he was infallible, his justice was perfect, and he ruled by divine right. If he became corrupt, the far would leave him. When the newly converted Persians were introduced to the Shiite concept of an infallible, divinely chosen imam, they didn't see it as a strange foreign concept.
It resonated with them.
It clicked perfectly with their ancient cultural software. It felt intuitively correct. It was this profound, almost subconscious blending of ancient Persian political theology with Islamic religious structure.
It is a phenomenal example of cultural syncretism. The concepts merge seamlessly. And in the 12-verse Shia tradition, this belief culminates in the concept of the 12th Imam, the Mahdi, who is believed to have not died but entered a state of occultation hidden from the world by God's will, destined to return at the end of time to fill the world with justice.
But long before that messianic hope, the defining core of Shiite identity was forged in a crucible of profound intergenerational trauma. And that brings us to the tragedy of Karbala.
Yes, 680 AD.
Right. Muawiyah has died, and his son Yazid has inherited the throne in Damascus. Ali's second son, Imam Hussein, absolutely refuses to pledge allegiance to Yazid, viewing him as a tyrant and a moral corruption of everything his grandfather built. Hussein starts receiving thousands of letters from supporters in the city of Kufa in Iraq, begging him to come, promising that if he arrives, they will rise up and overthrow the Umayyads.
But it's a trap, essentially.
Well, the authorities get to them. So Hussein sets out across the brutal desert with his family and a tiny group of devoted followers. But by the time he reaches the desolate plain of Karbala, the Umayyad authorities have used terror and bribery to flip Kufa. The supporters abandon him. Hussein is intercepted and surrounded by a massive, heavily armed Umayyad army.
It is a standoff with zero hope of military victory. The Umayyad army cuts off their access to water. On the 10th day of the month of Muharram, known as Ashura, Hussein and his men, historically recorded as just 72 devotees facing thousands, are slaughtered in the heat of the desert. Hussein himself is beheaded.
It's just devastating.
The women and children, led by Hussein's sister Zainab, are taken captive, bound in chains, and marched across the desert to the court in Damascus. The text specifically highlights Zainab's incredible, defiant bravery in the face of the caliph, holding her devastated family together.
If you want to understand the psychological weight of Karbala on the Shiite mindset, the source provides some powerful analogies. It compares the intensity, the deep sorrow, and the communal function of mourning for Hussein to the Christian mourning of the crucifixion, or the ancient Persian myth of mourning the innocent betrayed Prince Siavosh.
It is a visceral, annual reliving of the ultimate sacrifice.
It really is. It isn't just history to them, it is a continuously present reality. There is a famous phrase, every day is Ashura, every land is Karbala.
But there is a crucial shift in how this trauma was interpreted, and we must explore the mechanism of that shift. For centuries, the traditional Shia religious scholars, the ulama, framed Karbala as a preordained cosmic inevitability. God wills for Hussein to suffer so that his blood would secure salvation for his followers.
Like it was predestined.
Exactly. The duty of the everyday believer was simply to weep, mourn, and seek intercession. But our source text highlights a radical theological revolution that occurred in the 1960s. Thinkers began to actively reread Karbala. They argued that Hussein was not a passive victim acting out a pre-written script. They argued he exercised profound free will.
Wow.
He saw a corrupt, tyrannical state, and he consciously chose to resist it, knowing it would cost him his life, to set an eternal blueprint for resistance against injustice.
That is a staggering psychological pivot. You go from weep for the inevitable victim to emulate the active revolutionary. If Hussein fought the tyrant of his day, the modern believer has a religious duty to fight the tyrant of their day.
Right.
The text points out that this specific reinterpretation of history provided the theological fuel and the legitimization for modern militant political action in Iran. It shows how historical memory isn't static. It is a tool that gets resharpened to fit the needs of the present moment.
Exactly. It moves from passive grief to active political mobilization. But returning to our 8th century timeline, the immediate aftermath of Karbala solidified the Umayyad dynasty's iron grip.
Yeah.
They ruled from Damascus as an unapologetically Arab-centric empire.
They saw themselves as superior.
They viewed themselves as the conquerors, and everyone else, including the Persians who had converted to Islam, as second-class citizens, known as Mawali. They subjected them to heavier taxes and systemic discrimination. And that sheer arrogance, that failure to integrate the conquered, sowed the seeds of their own violent destruction. Because out in the eastern province of Khorasan, the Persians were quietly building a revolution.
Right. The Umayyads are deeply unpopular. They have blood on their hands from Karbala, so they lack religious legitimacy, and they treat the non-Arabs like dirt. So an underground network of propagandists starts operating in the shadows of Khorasan. They are working on behalf of the Abbasid family, who claim legitimacy because they are descendants of the Prophet's uncle, Abbas.
And their messaging is flawless.
Their pitch is incredibly effective. Overthrow the racist, corrupt Umayyads and restore leadership to the rightful holy family of the Prophet. And the man who takes this underground movement and turns it into a military juggernaut is a Khorasani Persian named Abu Muslim.
We must analyze Abu Muslim's organizational genius. He wasn't just a general, he was a master of coalition building. In 747, he unfurls the black banners of revolution in Marv. He manages to unite deeply disparate groups, disenfranchised Persian converts, Arab settlers who felt ignored by Damascus, and even various Shiite factions who believed the Abbasids would hand power back to the line of Ali.
He builds a relentless, disciplined army and marches them westward.
Yes. By 750, this Khorasani army utterly shatters the Umayyad forces at the Battle of the River Zab in Iraq. They hunt down the last Umayyad caliph in Egypt and kill him. The Abbasid dynasty is installed on the throne. The Arab historian Jahiz later described the Abbasids as a Khorasani Persian dynasty because they owed their very existence to Abu Muslim and his troops.
Okay, wait. Let's look at the human behavior here. Abu Muslim is the ultimate kingmaker. He literally hands the Abbasids the keys to the largest empire on earth. So why, almost immediately after they consolidate power, does the second Abbasid Caliph Mansur invite Abu Muslim to his court, trick him, and have his personal assassins hack him to death?
It seems like a terrible betrayal.
How do you justify murdering the man who built your throne?
You don't justify it morally. You analyze it through the brutal physics of absolute power. This is the dictator's dilemma, a pattern we see endlessly in history. A general who is wildly successful, adored by his troops, and possesses an independent power base, as Abu Muslim did in Khorasan, is a walking existential threat to a monarch.
Because he could just replace them.
Mansur looked at Abu Muslim and realized a terrifying truth. The man who possesses the power to make a caliph also possesses the power to unmake one. Gratitude is a massive liability in imperial politics. The text explicitly compares this dynamic to later Iranian history, like the Qajar dynasty in the 19th century, where capable, incredibly loyal viziers were murdered by the shahs simply out of a paranoid realization that the vizier was more competent than the king. Survival for an autocrat requires the elimination of any rival center of gravity.
It is entirely ruthless. But the Abbasids weren't stupid. They murdered their greatest Persian champion, but they fundamentally understood that they could not run this massive empire using the old Arab tribal methods, so they completely restructured the DNA of the state. First, they abandoned Damascus. They moved the capital eastward, into Iraq, near the ruins of the old Sasanian capital.
They build a magnificent new city and call it Baghdad.
Which, fun fact, is a Persian word meaning God's gift.
I love that detail. The geographical shift to Baghdad symbolized a total cultural paradigm shift. The Abbasids discarded the Arab exclusivity of the Umayyads and actively embraced Persian imperial traditions. They adopted the complex, highly ritualized court etiquette of the Sasanian King of Kings. They began officially celebrating Nowruz, the Persian New Year. But most critically, they resurrected the defining feature of Sasanian administration, the office of the vizier.
The prime minister.
The vizier was the prime minister, the absolute head of the bureaucracy, the man who actually pulled the levers of the empire while the caliph sat on the throne.
And nobody, absolutely nobody, exemplifies this new Persian deep state better than the Barmakid family. Their story is phenomenal. The Barmakids originally came from Balkh in modern-day Afghanistan, where their ancestors had been the high priests of a massive Buddhist temple.
Talk about a cultural pivot.
Right. They convert to Islam, move to Baghdad, and within a few generations, this single-family Khalid, his son Yahya, and his grandsons Jafar and Fazl are essentially running the known world. They are the viziers to the most powerful Abbasid caliphs, culminating with the legendary Harun al-Rashid. They control the treasury, they appoint the generals, they manage the postal system. They are the absolute peak of bureaucratic soft power.
They were the indispensable men. But the mechanism of their downfall is exactly the same as Abu Muslim's. They hit the invisible, lethal ceiling of autocracy. Over decades, the Barmakids accumulated so much wealth, so much patronage, and so much day-to-day control over the empire's machinery that Caliph Harun al-Rashid realized he was practically a guest in his own government.
They were too powerful.
The soft power of the bureaucrats had eclipsed the hard power of the monarch, so Harun acted with sudden, devastating brutality. He ordered a wholesale massacre of the family. He executed Jafar, imprisoned the rest, and seized their incalculable wealth. It was a terrifying reminder that while the Persians ran the administration, the caliph still held the sword.
But the wild thing is, even after purging the Barmakids, the system didn't revert. The Abbasids were so deeply dependent on Persian administration that the machine just kept rolling. And this profound integration reaches its absolute zenith under Caliph Mamun.
Yes, Mamun's era is fascinating.
Mamun's mother was a Persian concubine. He actually has to fight a devastating civil war against his own brother, Amin, for the throne. Mamun wins, heavily backed by a brilliant Persian general named Tarar, who is famously known as the ambidextrous because he could fight perfectly with a sword in either hand.
Which is such a cool historical detail.
When Mamun takes power, he heavily favors the Persians and the Shiites. He even attempts a radical political reconciliation by naming the 8th Shiite imam, Imam Reza, as his heir apparent.
Though that attempt at reconciliation ended abruptly when Imam Reza died shortly after, poisoned, according to deep-seated Shiite historical belief, potentially because the Abbasid establishment revolted against the idea. But despite that failure, Mamun's reign is defined by something else entirely. He turned Baghdad into the undisputed intellectual capital of the planet.
The House of Wisdom.
Exactly. He launched a massive state-sponsored cultural renaissance. He built the House of Wisdom. He gathered translators, scientists, and philosophers, Persians, Greeks, Syriac Christians, Indians, to translate the knowledge of the ancient world into Arabic.
But the most explosive part of Mamun's reign wasn't just translation. It was his aggressive state sponsorship of a theological school called the Mu'tazila. This is where the history gets deeply philosophical. The Mu'tazila were essentially Islamic rationalists. They took the rigorous tools of Aristotelian logic and Greek philosophy and applied them directly, fearlessly, to Islamic theology and the Quran itself.
Which was a deeply provocative methodology. Let's analyze why this caused such a massive societal rupture. The Mu'tazila argued that the Quran could not always be taken literally, that God gave humans reason, and reason must be used to interpret the text esoterically. But their two most controversial doctrines struck at the very core of Orthodox belief. First, they debated the nature of the Quran itself. The Orthodox mainstream believed the Quran was the uncreated, eternal word of God, existing alongside God forever. The Mu'tazila applied pure logic and said, wait, if God is eternal and the Quran is also eternal, you have two eternal entities.
Which breaks the rule of one God.
Exactly. That compromises strict, absolute monotheism. Therefore, they argued, the Quran must have been created by God at a specific moment in time.
To modern ears, that sounds like, an academic debate for seminary students. But to the Orthodox masses of the 9th century, arguing that the Holy Book was created felt like a devastating demotion of the text's sacred divine nature. But that wasn't even the biggest issue. The debate that truly riled people up, the one that caused actual riots, was the debate over free will.
Yes. The Orthodox mainstream, championed by groups like the Ash'ariya, believed in strict determinism, or predestination. Their logic was that God is absolutely sovereign and all-powerful. Therefore, God must author and preordain every single action in the universe, both good and evil.
Everything is written.
Exactly. The Mu'tazila vehemently rejected this. championing absolute human free will. And they built their argument on the concept of divine justice. They argued, if God is perfectly just, how can he logically punish a human being in hell for committing a sin if God himself preordained that the human would commit it? A just God must grant humans the free will to choose between right and wrong.
If you're listening to this and wondering why on earth a medieval peasant or a shopkeeper in Baghdad cared about Aristotelian logic and free will, you have to connect it to the politics of the street.
It was incredibly political.
If God preordains everything, then the corrupt caliph sitting on the throne taxing you into poverty is there by the explicit will of God, and rebelling is a sin. But if humans have free will, then that corrupt caliph is just a bad leader making bad choices, and you have the moral right to overthrow him. The theology directly threatened the power structures.
And the Orthodox detractors viciously attacked the Mu'tazila. They literally called them Muslim Zoroastrians, because the idea of humans choosing between good and evil sounded exactly like the ancient Persian dualistic religion.
The pushback was intense.
It was so fierce, led by incredibly stubborn Orthodox figures like Ahmad ibn Hanbal, that eventually later caliphs had to completely abandon and persecute the Mu'tazila just to stop the civil unrest.
But even though the rationalist theology was suppressed, the intellectual doors had been blown wide open, and the Persian contribution to the resulting Golden Age was staggering. The great Arab historian and sociologist Ibn Khaldun famously observed this phenomenon centuries later. He wrote, "If learning were suspended in the highest parts of heaven, the Persians would attain it." The Arabs possessed the political empire, but the Persians entirely dominated the intellectual sciences.
And the great irony, the fascinating mechanism of this cultural conquest, is that the Persians wrote their masterpieces almost entirely in Arabic.
Exactly. Arabic became the lingua franca, much like Latin was in medieval Europe or English is in global science today. The fact that they wrote in Arabic didn't erase their Persian identity. It meant they were literally structuring the thoughts of their conquerors. My absolute favorite example of this is Arabic grammar.
Oh, Sibawayh.
Yes. The Foundational Rules, the definitive textbook of Arabic grammar, was written by a Persian scholar named Sibawayh. A Persian man had to teach the Arabs the formal syntactic rules of their own sacred language. That is the ultimate historical flex. We lost the war, but let me correct your grammar.
It highlights who was doing the real intellectual labor of the empire. And the contributions spanned every conceivable discipline. In mathematics, you have Khwarazmi, a Persian genius working in Baghdad, who gave the world the first systematic solution of linear and quadratic equations. His foundational book gave us the term algebra, and his own name, translated into Latin, became the root of the word algorithm.
Incredible.
In medicine, the ancient Sasanian clinical traditions were seamlessly integrated. Towering figures like Rhazes or Al-Razi and Avicenna Ibn Sina were not merely physicians. They were massive philosophical intellects who blended Neoplatonism with Islamic theology. They were the undisputed rock stars of the intellectual world.
And this overwhelming Persian dominance in the culture actually sparked a massive empire-wide culture war known as the Shubugoa movement. This wasn't a war fought with swords. It was fought with poetry, essays, and vicious literary critiques. The Persian elites and the Arab elites were publicly debating who was culturally superior.
It got quite personal, too.
Oh, yeah. The Persians would write essays boasting about their ancient kings and complex philosophy while mocking the Arabs as uncultured desert nomads. The Arabs would fire back about their martial prowess and the purity of their language. It shows that beneath the umbrella of a unified Islamic empire, intense ethnic pride and cultural competition were boiling.
It was a highly sophisticated literary battleground. But we have to pivot our perspective here. While the wealthy elites and philosophers are having high-minded debates about free will and cultural superiority in the opulent palaces of Baghdad, the situation out in the rugged eastern provinces is absolutely unhinged.
Totally chaotic.
We see a series of bizarre, explosive, and colorful revolts against the caliphate. We need to analyze the psychology of why ordinary people were launching these massive, often suicidal rebellions.
Right, because these weren't organized attempts by displaced Sasanian nobles trying to put a king back on the throne. The Sasanian Empire was dead to these people. These rebellions were this volatile, crazy cocktail of religious heresy, intense economic desperation over abated taxation, and pure anti-state rage. And the spark that lit the powder keg for many of them was the lingering trauma over the murder of Abu Muslim.
The kingmaker.
Exactly. The people in Khorasan felt utterly betrayed by the abased caliphs they had put in power. They simply refused to believe their hero was dead. It created this messianic, conspiratorial expectation that he would return.
It is the classic king in the mountains psychological archetype. When a society experiences profound trauma and powerlessness, they often generate a myth that a savior figure is merely hidden, waiting for the right moment to return and dispense justice. We see this with a figure named Eshak the Turk, who launched a revolt claiming Abu Muslim was not dead but was simply hiding in the Alborz mountains.
But Ishak is a relatively tame example compared to the truly extreme cults of personality that emerged in this vacuum of despair.
True.
Let's talk about the wildest one, Muqana, the veiled prophet. This guy sounds like a comic book supervillain, but he was a real, terrifying historical figure. He was born in Marv, and he builds this mesmerizing cult. He wore a permanent veil or a mask over his face.
His followers thought he was hiding his divine light.
Right. His fanatical followers claimed his face shone with the blinding light of God, while his enemies, naturally, claimed he wore it to hide hideous deformities. He essentially claimed divinity, blending Islamic heresy with old, radical pre-Islamic ideas of wealth redistribution. But his most famous parlor trick, the thing that absolutely cemented his control over the masses, was this illusion he pulled off in the city of Nakshab. Every night, from the bottom of a deep well, he would somehow project a glowing spherical object high into the sky, the false moon of Nakshab.
The theatricality of the false moon is fascinating because it demonstrates the lengths to which charismatic leaders will go to manufacture miracles to control a desperate populace. But the psychological hold he had over his followers is best illustrated by how the rebellion ended.
It's so dark.
In 786, the caliph's massive armies finally trapped Muqana and his followers in their mountain fortress. There is no escape. A normal rebel would surrender or die fighting. But Muqana wants to ensure that his followers never find his corpse, which would prove he was just a mortal man. So he gathers his family and his most devoted followers, and they all voluntarily burn themselves alive in the fortress. He manufactured his own disappearance to cement his divine myth.
It is a terrifying testament to the power of a cult of personality. And he wasn't the only one giving Baghdad a headache. You also have Babak the Khorrami. His movement entrenched itself in the impenetrable mountains of Azerbaijan. For more than 20 years, Babak waged a relentless, incredibly successful guerrilla war against the caliphate.
20 years is a long time to fight an empire.
He humiliated multiple massive imperial armies sent to crush him. He was eventually outmaneuvered, captured, and executed, ironically, by a Persian general working for the caliph.
The Abbasid military machine ultimately crushed all these rebellions. They had the manpower and the resources. But we must look at the systemic cost. The effort required to put out these massive, multi-decade fires across the far reaches of the empire fundamentally exhausted the center.
They were just burning cash.
Exactly. The caliphs in Baghdad were burning through their treasury and their political capital. They were slowly losing their grip on the distant provinces. And in politics, nature abhors a vacuum. This imperial exhaustion perfectly paved the way for the final phase of our deep dive. The Persian Renaissance, where autonomous Persian dynasties finally rise from the ashes to reclaim hard political power.
To understand how the Persians got their own kings back, we have to look at a massive unforced error by the Abbasid caliphs. The caliphs had grown deeply paranoid. They didn't trust the Arab tribes anymore, and they certainly didn't trust the Persian generals who kept rebelling or getting too powerful. So they decided to outsource the military.
Always a risky move.
Yeah, they began buying thousands of Turkish slave soldiers, known as gilmen, from the steppes of Central Asia to serve as their royal guard. What could possibly go wrong?
It is a catastrophic miscalculation that repeats throughout history, relying on a mercenary Praetorian Guard. Over time, these Turkish commanders looked around and realized they held a monopoly on physical force in Baghdad. They began dictating state policy. If a caliph disagreed with them, they would depose him, blind him, or simply murder him and install a more compliant relative on the throne.
The caliph became a hostage.
A mere spiritual figurehead. With the center completely paralyzed by these Turkish generals, the Persian governors out in the eastern provinces realized they no longer had to answer to Baghdad. They could operate with virtual independence.
And so we see the rise of these fascinating autonomous dynasties. First, you have the Tahirids in Khorasan, founded by that ambidextrous general we mentioned earlier. They play the political game perfectly. They technically swear loyalty to the caliph, they send him his tribute money, and they mention his name in the Friday prayers. But functionally, they are running their own sovereign state.
Right. Independence in all but name.
But then, right on their heels, you get the Saffarids. And their story is completely different. This is the story of Yaqub the coppersmith.
Yaqub is a profound historical anomaly. Most dynasties are founded by disaffected nobles or rogue generals. Yaqub, as his name explicitly states, was a humble coppersmith from the incredibly remote, harsh province of Sistan. He abandoned his trade, became an outlaw, and essentially functioned as a Robin Hood figure, robbing the wealthy caravans and gathering a fiercely loyal band of followers.
He was associated with the Kurajites, right?
He was likely associated with the radical egalitarian Kurajite sect. Through sheer military genius and undeniable charisma, this common bandit conquers his way to absolute power. He shatters the Tahirid dynasty, captures massive swaths of territory, and builds an empire. And unlike the Tahirids, Yaqub possessed zero reverence for the caliph. He openly defied Baghdad, and in fact he died of illness while actively marching his army to attack the caliph directly.
It is the ultimate rags-to-riches warlord narrative. But Yaqub's empire is a flash in the pan. It falls apart shortly after his death. The dynasty that replaces him, however, has a much more profound and lasting cultural impact. The Samanids.
Based in Bokhara.
Right, based in the city of Bokhara in Central Asia. The Samanids were deeply loyal, Orthodox Sunni Muslims. They respected the caliph. But their true legacy is that under their generous patronage, the Persian language, which had been evolving underground for centuries, explodes back onto the literary scene as New Persian, or Dari, written in the Arabic script.
The Samanids fostered an environment where classical Persian literature could take its first majestic, confident steps. They heavily patronized poets like Rudaki, who was widely considered the founding father of classical Persian poetry. And we must understand that the poetry of this era wasn't just flowery praise for the king, it possessed a profound, almost weaponized emotional and psychological power.
Yes.
Our source text highlights a famous anecdote recorded by the medieval essayist Nizami Aruzi concerning Rudaki and the Samanid emir Nasr ibn Alha.
This is one of my absolute favorite historical anecdotes. So the emir sets up a lavish, sprawling campsite outside his capital city of Bokhara. It's so beautiful that he just refuses to leave. Months and months go by. His army, his viziers, his administrators, they're all deeply homesick and desperate to get back to their families in the city.
But you don't cross the emir.
Exactly. He's an autocrat and no one dares tell him it's time to pack up. So the administrators secretly beg the poet, Rudaki, to intervene. Rudaki waits for the right moment, takes his harp, and composes a seemingly simple, deeply nostalgic poem about the rough sands of the Oxus River feeling like silk and the smell of the breeze from Bokhara. He sings it to the emir.
And the reaction is immediate.
The poem so perfectly, so devastatingly captures the visceral longing for home that the emir is completely overwhelmed. He jumps to his feet, leaps onto his horse without even putting his shoes on, and gallops for Bokhara, leaving his entire massive retinue behind. That is the sheer cultural power of early Persian poetry.
It perfectly illustrates the immense cultural premium placed on eloquence and the capacity of art to influence autocratic power where politics failed. But the Samanids were not just patrons of the arts, they were deep supporters of the sciences. And that leads us to another incredible mechanism of problem-solving from the source text, involving the great physician Rhazes, or Al-Razi, treating a different Samanid emir.
Oh, this is a wild, early example of extreme psychological therapy. So the Samanid emir suffers from paralyzed legs. None of his local court doctors can cure him. So they send for Rhazes, who lives weeks away in Rhaz. When Rhazes finally arrives at the massive Oxus River, he absolutely refuses to get in the boat to cross. He says, if the boat sinks and I drown, people will blame me for taking the risk. They literally have to bind his hands and force him onto the boat.
He was a character.
Once he reaches the court, he tries all the traditional medical treatments, ointments, herbs, diets, but nothing works. Finally, he tells the emir, I have one radical treatment left, but we must be completely alone in the bathhouse. No guards.
And here we see the brilliant, unorthodox clinical mind of Rhazes at work. He takes the emir in the bathhouse, strips him, gives him warm water and soothing medicines, deliberately lulling him into a deeply relaxed, vulnerable state. And then, without any warning, Rhazes executes a drastic behavioral shift. He starts screaming vile abuse at the emir. He curses him for forcing him to cross the river. He draws a sharp blade and physically threatens the paralyzed ruler.
The emir is utterly terrified. He thinks this mad doctor is about to assassinate him in a locked bathhouse. The terror is so absolute, the spike of adrenaline is so violent, that the emir's brain completely forgets he is supposed to be paralyzed. Instinctively, in pure panic, he leaps to his feet. He manages to stand up and then immediately passes out from the shock.
And when he wakes up,
the paralysis is entirely gone. Rhazes, meanwhile, didn't stick around to say, "You're welcome." He immediately fled the city on a fast horse, knowing the emir's first reaction upon waking might be to execute the man who just threatened his life.
It is a highly theatrical intervention. But let's analyze the sophisticated medical philosophy underneath it. Rhazes correctly diagnosed the paralysis not as permanent physical nerve damage, but as a hysterical psychosomatic block. He understood that a profound, sudden psychological shock could override the mental barrier causing the physical symptom. It demonstrates a stunningly advanced understanding of the mind-body connection in 10th century Persian medicine.
Moving west from the Samanids, we encounter a very different kind of Persian power, the Buyids. These are tough, rugged Shiite highlanders from the Dalaman Mountains near the Caspian Sea, the area that resisted conversion the longest. They march down from the mountains with a hardened army and literally conquer Baghdad.
But they don't abolish the caliphate.
No, they just
Okay.
turn the Sunni caliph into their personal puppet. They rule the empire while keeping the caliph around strictly to sign documents and provide religious legitimacy for the Sunni masses. The most powerful Buyid ruler, Azod al-Dawleh, takes a massive symbolic step that brings history full circle. He revives the ancient Sasanian title of Shahanshah, the King of Kings.
The Buyids represent the absolute apex of the Persian political interlude, exercising direct, hard control over the historical heart of the Islamic world. But imperial power eventually fragments, leading to the rise of the final dynasty we will examine today, the Ghaznavids. And the Ghaznavids are crucial because they represent a profound cultural turning point. They're not ethnically Persian. They're founded by Turkish slave soldiers who broke away from the Samanid Empire.
But culturally, they are entirely Persianized.
They adopt the Persian language, the complex court customs, and the administrative structures.
Their most famous ruler, Mahmud of Ghazna, is a brilliant, ruthless military commander. He conquers a massive empire stretching deep into India. But because he wants to be seen as a legitimate, cultured monarch, he becomes a massive patron of Persian arts. He surrounds his court with poets and scholars. And this brings us to the legendary story of Ferdowsi.
The author of the Shahnameh.
Yes, Ferdowsi is the man who dedicates his life to writing the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings. It is a massive epic poem that single-handedly preserves the pre-Islamic history, myths, and language of Persia. Ferdowsi dedicates this masterpiece to Mahmud, fully expecting the traditional royal reward of gold.
Mahmud, however, perhaps lacking a true appreciation for the depth of the Persian nationalist sentiment embedded in the poem, or perhaps simply being tight-fisted with his treasury, rewards Ferdowsi not with the promised gold, but with a significantly smaller amount of cheap silver.
And Ferdowsi is deeply, profoundly insulted. He is at a public bathhouse when the royal emissary arrives with the silver. To show his utter public contempt for the Sultan's cheapness, Ferdowsi takes the royal reward, uses a piece of it to buy a beer, tips the bathkeeper with the rest of it, and immediately flees the city to avoid the Sultan's wrath.
And then he writes the ultimate diss track.
He does. While in hiding, he writes a savage hajme, tearing apart Mahmud's character, his low-born slave origins, and his lack of true royal grace. It is the ultimate artist's revenge against an autocrat.
It is a legend, but it perfectly encapsulates the defining tension of the entire era. You have Turkish military rulers wielding absolute physical power, commanding vast armies, yet they are completely dependent on Persian artists, poets, and bureaucrats to grant them cultural legitimacy and administrative functionality. They control the territory, but the Persians control the narrative, and that dynamic brings our historical journey full circle.
Okay, we have covered a massive expanse of history today. From the sudden, shocking collapse of the Sasanian King of Kings to the birth of Islam in the desert, we've tracked the slow, pragmatic burn of conversion, the bloody religious schisms, the Abbasid revolution, the intellectual heights of rationalist philosophy, the madness of the masked prophets, and the resurgence of Persian dynasties. So, pulling all this together, what does this actually mean?
If we synthesize this vast journey, what we are really observing is the profound, undeniable resilience of a culture. We saw the Sasanian state crumble into dust in a matter of years, exposed as a hollow, unpopular shell. But the defeated civilization did not disappear. It adapted. The Persians utilized their deep bureaucratic genius, their insatiable intellectual curiosity, and their rich linguistic heritage to seamlessly integrate themselves into the new Islamic reality. They became indispensable. They did not just passively participate in the Islamic Golden Age. In many fundamental ways, they structured it, drove it, and defined it. They captured the administrative and intellectual soul of the very civilization that had conquered them militarily.
Which leads us to a final thought for you to mull over. We are so used to measuring the success of a conquest by borders drawn on a map, by treaties signed, by the flags flying over a capital city. But looking at the Persian assimilation of the Islamic caliphates, it asks a profound, almost unsettling question about power. If your military is completely defeated, but your vanquished scholars write the rules of grammar for the conqueror's sacred language, your bureaucrats run their economy, and your philosophers define their theology, who actually conquered whom? What is the true measure of a civilization's resilience? Think back to that hollow bank analogy we talked about at the very beginning. The Arab conquest blew the corrupt corporate structure away, but the employees, the deep, ancient cultural roots of Persia, just went to work for the new management and eventually ended up running the entire global enterprise. Thank you for coming along with us on this deep dive into the source material. Keep questioning the surface of history, keep exploring the incredible mechanics of human resilience and cultural fusion, and we will see you next time.